So for this tutorial, we're going to talk about words that have sounds with different positions. So what I mean by that is, say for instance, the word cat. That's kind of a tricky word for some kids when they're developing their words and their language more consistently, because the word cat has different positions for the articulators. So k starts in the back where your voice box is, and it goes to the front. Cat. And for some kids, that transition can be pretty tricky. If it was something like tat or cack, that's usually easier. I know those are silly made up words, but that's just kind of an example right now because I can't think of any words that have those sounds. So for instance, cat, when I'm working with someone who has a little bit of difficulty, who will either say tat or cack, again, just as an example, depending on the word that we're doing, then I'll usually try to use a visual cue. So if your child is starting to understand and learn letters, and you can always show them, you can write it down. I usually get a crayon with a piece of paper or a dry erase board, and I'll write down the word just to show them that extra visual cue. Otherwise, you can show them the picture or the object if it's during play, if it's during conversation. Obviously, if you don't have a picture, any visuals around, because you're not always going to have that when words come up in conversation, that's fine. But what I typically try to do, so for example, the word cat, if a child is having trouble with that, I'll usually prompt them. So I'll say k, at, to either break up the word and then try to get them to say the whole thing, cat. And if that's not working, then I'll just do cat, cat. I usually show them first and then gently tap their neck or get them to touch their own neck, do hand over hand, just so again they feel the sensation, and it's more visual, tactile for them. It's more practical for them to learn. So cat, cat, and try to get them to say it. If they're having trouble saying the whole word, you can just break it down. Cat, cat. Or if you need to break it down even simpler than that, k, 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 at, cat. Or if they're having trouble with the last part, you can say k, at, k, at. You're not always going to have this, obviously. Sometimes there are words that have sounds that aren't necessarily in the front or the back, they're in the middle, but these are the more visual kinds of words. So if you're also working on book, for example, it would be the same thing. Book, book. And you can break down the word however you need to, so that the child really starts to understand it. And the same applies to words, that go from the back to the front to the back. So for instance, I did cat, and now I'm going to show an example of a word that has the back sound at the end. So here's the duck, duck, duck. So that's a nice way to teach them transition. You can also do this with different words. It's not just the simple ones like these. Even if there are longer words, you can break them up. If your child is having difficulty with syllables, for instance, I would just do hand over hand tapping. So I'm trying to think of something here. There's something in the book that has a bunch of syllables. So for example, here's an umbrella. Some children will say brella, or something like that, where they either skip the first part. It's also called weak syllable deletion, so children sometimes omit the weakest syllable in that word, and that's because there's more stress on the other words, the other parts of the word, I mean. So umbrella, for instance, you can always do hand over hand tapping, which is something that I like to do with them, and I go umbrella, umbrella. Another thing I can do would be to have more visuals. So for instance, I'm just using these as an example, but if I would have laminated stars or whatever you have at home. If your child is playing with cars, if your child is playing with blocks, I would just get a bunch of those blocks together. So if you're saying the word umbrella, for instance, get 3 blocks and then point to each one. So I'm going to use these stars as an example. So we would say umbrella, umbrella, so that they have that visual cue of seeing that the word is broken up into parts, feeling it when you tap it out, umbrella, seeing it with the blocks, tapping it out with their hands, and then hearing it as well. Another strategy I like to use with some kids who need an extra an extra tip or an extra technique to use if that's not working, I like to add like a sing-song voice. So umbrella or umbrella. So you can kind of move your hand around. It's just something to break it up so it's not so monotonous. If they're not really feeling the umbrella with a tactile or with the visual, sometimes they need an extra sing-song way to do it. And some kids who love music may respond better to that. It all depends on what kind of a learner your child is. So, and that could change by the day, it could change by the hour. Maybe for some words they prefer the tapping out, for some words they prefer the sing-song voice. So there's no rhyme or reason. In doing that, you can kind of make up your own sing-song voice, whether it's umbrella or umbrella, whatever your child responds to best. And obviously, you know, you don't want them to walk around saying it like that in conversation, but it's a nice way for them to get to know it. And all these techniques of tapping it out, using the visual cues, using the sing-song voice, all of those things can be faded out over time. This is just a way to get your child to learn it. And like all things, it just takes a lot of practice, exposure, and whatever works best for your child. You can use all three of those techniques at the same time. You can use one of them, whatever works best for your child. So those are just some examples of how to teach words that have many syllables, whether it's 2 syllables, 3 syllables, whatever it is, and also words that have different places of articulation, we call them. So, you know, book or cat, and things like that.